that. For education, this means building resilient education systems to mitigate the impacts of climate change on children's learning. But education can also play a crucial role in building green skills for a changing world and developing a new consciousness around climate change. This is the paradigm shift we need as we rethink how we organize our lives, societies, and economies to address the impacts of climate change. I want to introduce our next session, The Way Forward, Tackling Climate Change Through Education.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So climate change is an existential threat to humanity and a key policy issue of our time. Yet global leaders continue to ignore the negative impact that climate-related disasters and environmental stressors have on children's well-being and their ability to go to school and learn. These impacts are particularly acute for society's most vulnerable populations, including girls, children with disabilities, refugees, and indigenous communities. By not orienting our education systems today towards climate action and climate resilience for all, we will be undercutting our collective ability in 2030, 2040, and 2050 to survive and thrive in a world radically altered by global warming, biodiversity loss, and environmental destruction. But as the world works to implement the Paris Agreement, we really need to pay attention to Article 12 of the agreement that is focused on action for climate empowerment. Article 12 points to the importance of education and training as a critical path to climate empowerment for all members of society, especially those most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. This part of the Paris Agreement urges countries to see quality education, or what I like to call a new green learning agenda, as part of countries' national strategies on climate change. A quality, gender-transformative education can increase the resilience of society to the changes and disruptions caused by climate change and equip young people with the knowledge, skills, and competencies, the mindsets and the attitudes and the behaviors and the values to build more sustainable futures. Addressing climate change through education requires a reimagination of the continuum of green skills, from the specific skills to fuel just transitions to greener economies, to the generic skills necessary for greener, more sustainable behavioral change, to the transformative skills necessary to address the underlying inequities driving the climate crisis and to which the impacts of climate change exacerbate. It also entails raising awareness among education and non-education decision makers, aligning the global education and climate change agendas and financing, and understanding shared and fair responsibility between the developed and developing world. So as part of the Global Education Summit, I'm delighted to convene a discussion on the way forward, tackling climate change through education. I'm Christina Kwauk, non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution and research director at Unbounded Associates, and I'm working on girls' education and climate change. I'm joined now by a panel including Suzanne Ehlers, the CEO of the Malala Fund, and Shradha Koirala, GPE youth leader from Nepal. Welcome to the session, Suzanne and Shradha. So let me start with you, Shradha. You've been living through the effects of climate change. Just last month, Nepal saw flash floods and landslides in the Himalayan region caused by an increasingly erratic monsoon season that was also exacerbated by unprecedented wildfires driven by increased periods of drought. So first, how are you and how are your family doing?
Well, we are still facing this problem of flood and landslide. When I am speaking here, it's raining so much heavily outside, and many families are being disrupted by this flood, by this landslide. So we still don't know the full impact of what this flood or what this landslide will continue, as we are just in the beginning of the monsoon season. And right now, many families, including my families, also have been displaced, and we are struggling with access to essentials like food, water, and shelter. So school buildings and homes are already being destroyed. And I'm not sharing you only my story that is just for 1 or 2 months. We have been facing so many effects of such climate change since few years, and the impact lasts for a very long time. So when disaster hits, children and youth face the worst of the consequences. In 2015, also, we had a massive earthquake. The impact of earthquake has been so huge that even after 6 years, we are still struggling to build back. Many of the children are yet not being able to go back to the school because the nearby school buildings were completely destroyed during that time. So after that also we have been experiencing several aftershocks, and children and youth are afraid to go to the school. So I feel this is not only my story, but the story of many developing nations like Nepal. So as natural disaster increase and become worse in frequency due to this climate change, children and youth will face the burden for many years to come. So every year in monsoon season, there is problem of floods and landslide, displacing millions of children, youth, and adults. So we have to travel from one place to another temporarily, because of which children or youth, they are not able to attend to the schools, and ultimately they drop out from the school system. So this disaster also impact to the not only the education but also economic situation of the families, because they have to lose their property, their income, their grains, their agriculture products, and even their farmland also. So they are being economically deprived because of this situation. So loss of incomes means there is no money to pay for the school, or if we say in the current situation, no money to pay for the digital learning. So children and youth are under the pressure to go for the income generating activities rather than going back to the school. So this disaster have also led to increase in cases of child marriage, especially in my country, because when parents don't have income and when girls don't go to the schools, they are married at an early age. So there is ultimately the psychosocial impact. Children and youth are being disturbed by the disasters that are caused by the climate change. So what we are seeing is that I don't see only the impact to the education, but also the health, and there are several economic impact, and all of these are linked together with one another. So in a way, the impact of disaster is very similar to ongoing impact of COVID pandemic, which we all have been predicting, because children can't go back to the school because we don't have resilient teaching and learning mechanisms. So situations are very much getting worse, and there are lots of stories to tell. But I would like to stop here.
Well, I'm glad that your family has been able to at least adapt to the current circumstances. But what you speak about certainly points to the types of disruptions, education disruptions, economic disruptions, social and livelihood disruptions that are only to become more exacerbated in the future. So thank you for sharing some of the insights that you've been seeing and observing and experiencing. So Suzanne, I'd like to turn over to you, in particular because Shradha's accounts link directly to the report that the Malala Fund published this year on girls' education and climate change. So maybe tell us a little bit about the links that you all have been most concerned about, especially between girls' education and climate change.
Christina, thanks for the question. Let me start, though, if I could, just thanking Shradha for the intervention and for the courage that she's brought to today's conversation. I think any conversation around climate change and girls' education has to start with the voice and the lived experience of girls and youth leaders. So, Shradha, thank you for grounding this panel discussion in what you're experiencing firsthand in Nepal. Christina, we know that there are so many well-known solutions to climate change. There are solar panels, there are electric cars, there are wind farms. All are sort of well-established and well-known. But we know that if we want to secure a greener future and a fairer future, that educating girls has to be at the center of that solution. It's one of the most powerful interventions that we know in the sort of fight against climate. The skill that girls learn at school, so everything from critical thinking to creative problem solving, all of that better prepares girls to advocate for themselves, to secure green jobs in the labor workforce, to develop solutions to climate change that address the social justice issues that we know are so at the heart of so many girls' interest in climate. It also helps countries develop and build climate resilience, establish more equal workforce, grow their economies, all with the input of well-educated girls who have been educated in a way to be critical thinkers and leaders in their own environments. The reality, of course, though, is that women and girls are disproportionately impacted by climate change. Climate disasters, flooding, droughts, they all amplify the inequalities that girls already face, and they further limit girls' ability to access and complete their education. So without urgent climate action, you know that by 2025, climate-related events might prevent at least 12.5 million more girls from completing their education each year. And that's what our latest report estimates. And that's why we're so involved and energetic in the battle against climate change and really incorporating the issues of girls' education.
I mean, you speak about this really quickly closing window of time that we have to transform our education systems into ones that are rooted in the goals of achieving both climate justice and gender justice. So I applaud you for really bringing that to the forefront and for really bringing that to the attention of our policy leaders and global leaders. So I want to dig a little deeper into that. One approach to really seeing some of this education systems transformation is to ensure that the skills and competencies that are targeted by curriculum, by pedagogical approaches, assessments, and learning outcomes are conceptualized in the context of green learning. And more than just skills, we also need to consider the mindsets and the worldviews that are nurtured through such green learning. Last year, I had the pleasure of collaborating with the Malala Fund on a complementary report published by Brookings that lays out what a framework for a new green learning agenda might look like and how we might reimagine a green skills continuum from specific skills, like you mentioned, Suzanne, like engineering, to ecosystem management for green jobs, to generic skills like coping with uncertainty and problem solving, to some of the more transformative skills like systems thinking or working with complexity, analyzing relations of power, which are all needed for successive collective action. So it's here in laying out a framework for a new green learning agenda that I'd like to turn back to Suzanne again. Your report similarly lays out a gender equal green learning agenda and describes 4 pillars to achieve this. Can you tell us a little bit more about these pillars and how is the Malala Fund supporting these pillars in its programs?
I'd be happy to. Thanks, Jen and Christina. You know this so beautifully because of our partnership on the report and on this work at the nexus of girls' education and climate. So the Gender Equal Green Learning Agenda proposes key education reforms to help every girl go to school and teach students the knowledge and the skills and the values that they need to speak out and challenge the social and economic inequalities that are fueling the climate crisis. So the framework, as you've suggested, centers on 4 pillars. The first is access, sort of quite straightforward, getting all girls in school learning for 12 full years. There's, of course, the skills component, which is around teaching girls an expanded vision of green skills. Values, which are around promoting sustainable values through climate education. And of course, activism, something near and dear to the heart of Malala and to Ziauddin and to the Malala Fund. So empowering students like Shradha to take action on climate justice and to challenge the social, political, and economic issues that are contributing to the crisis. For Malala Fund, we're addressing each of these pillars, all of these pillars in the work that we do. So what is at the heart of our response is always the support that we provide for local educators and local activists. They understand the needs of girls in their communities. So their approaches are based on where they are. And that is very much about that first pillar, really increasing girls' access to education. These activists are working together to pass laws and to increase education funding, convincing families, parents, and communities to let girls go to school and to develop new technologies to reach children with no school nearby, or in this time of COVID when everybody's been doing remote learning. We tackle the activism pillar in many ways, but I want to highlight Assembly, which is a digital publication for young women around the world. Many young climate activists have used it to talk about the ways that climate change is impacting their community and showing how they're taking action and encouraging other students and girls around the world to do the same. And on the advocacy front, we're outlining steps that governments must take to move through the gender equal learning agenda and address the climate crisis in their own national environments through education. So at COP26, I'll sort of give a couple of things that we're asking governments to do, and then I'll turn it back to you. One is that we're asking governments to limit the damage the climate crisis is causing to girls' education. That's acting urgently to reduce carbon emissions. It's supporting affected communities to adapt to the realities of climate change, and it's building economies back from COVID-19 in a way that's truly green and gender just. We're also asking countries to update their country climate strategies, the nationally determined contributions, to recognize the contribution, the really meaningful and real contribution that girls' education makes. We're asking governments to declare 2022 as a global year of action on climate education and renew and deliver on the commitment that was first made at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. And finally, we're asking country governments to commit to developing new national climate change learning strategies in time for the 28th Conference of the Parties in 2023. So a couple of ways that those pillars manifest in Malala Fund's work around the world, again, at the intersection of the climate crisis and girls' education. Thanks, Christina.
Such a powerful agenda, and especially on the road to COP26 this year. So I want to come back to you, Shradha. As Suzanne mentioned, really centering the voices of young people in this work is an incredibly important pathway. We've seen young people at the forefront of calls to address climate change at the local level, at the global level, and so on. And I would love for you to tell us a little bit about what you think world leaders who are gathering here today at the Global Education Summit, what change would you like to see them put into action to enable some of this action to happen?
Actually, I'm very happy to listen such things from Suzanne, because if the government or if the world leaders could commit on that, that would be really very much. But what I personally feel is that education is the only way to make sure that children are ready for the economy of the future, which will no doubt be shaped by the climate change. So if children receive 12 years of quality education, they are more likely to have the skills to withstand and overcome the challenges. And in turn, they can help their families and societies to adapt the effects of climate change. The skills that the children learn, such as literacy, numeracy, critical thinking, and problem-solving skills, all of these skills can help them become more resilient and their families to better process information about the risks, and they can act on this climate change issue also in timely. So for me, I think that world leaders should commit to build a brighter and more secure future for us by investing sufficiently and by investing efficiently in education, because I feel it is the missing link to tackle the climate change. It can save lives today and even educate the leaders of tomorrow. I also feel that there is a need to make investment to make teaching and learning more resilient. Since education is being disrupted several times by this pandemic, by the natural disasters, and we are more likely to face the similar situations in the future also. So let's learn lesson from today. This is the reason why I want to call the world leaders today to fully fund GP, which is working with partner countries to build stronger and more resilient education systems. While talking about the developing countries like Nepal, there is very limited climate literacy. People think that the issue of climate change is only for the developed countries. So I think today the world leaders also needs to focus on this agenda of climate literacy and needs to invest on it to ensure that children and youth from developing countries like Nepal have the knowledge and skills of how to better prepare for or how to respond to the disasters, because we will be the one who will be facing the more terrible consequences of climate change in the future. So I feel world leaders need to invest in our capacity to adapt so that we can work with our communities to mitigate the effects of climate change. And lastly, I would like to tell that young people have been leading the fight against the climate change. So listen to us. We want to preserve our world, the ecology, and the climate. We want to prevent more diseases from spreading and more disasters from occurring, because that is the world that we will inherit. So work with us, engage with us. We are smart, driven, and ready to become the future leaders. So world leaders, allow us to sit at the table and hear our voices.
Thank you so much, Shradha, for that excellent call to action. And thank you, Suzanne, for your wonderful agenda-setting work at the Malala Fund. Now I'd like to bring in the perspective of policymakers. I'm joined first by Minister Agnes Nyalonje, Malawi's Minister of Education. Welcome, Minister, and thank you for joining us today. I want to start off by asking you, what is the impact of climate change on education?
Thank you for having me on the program. The impact of climate change is being felt across the globe in all aspects of life, and the education in Malawi has not been spared. Schooling and learning systems are disrupted, affecting the right of children to education. Development gains in education are reversed with the damage or destruction of school facilities, or sometimes the use of school facilities as refuge centers for people suffering devastation, escaping from floods and storms. Floods also lead to widespread occurrence of waterborne diseases such as dysentery, which may lead to acute malnutrition amongst children. Evidence also shows that in times of disasters, the girl child often suffers sexual abuse as well as other forms of violence. Research shows that the longer schools remain closed, the more likely children are to not return to school. And then you also have the effect of the climate change on agriculture, which damages crops, affecting households' incomes, which means that a lot of parents may not be able to get their children to come back to school. So overall, if I was to summarize, you find that the effects not only affect the child and the household and their ability to have an income and therefore to support their child in school, but the school infrastructure itself is often damaged. Where school infrastructure is not damaged, what you find is that the local population is housed in schools, therefore disrupting the whole education system and setting the education calendar back. Those are some of the effects that we have experienced in Malawi and continue to experience during the rainy season usually.
So why do you think it's important to integrate climate literacy into education?
It's very important to integrate climate change education or literacy in the education system as a whole. It is through such education that the impacts I've described above can be combated. For example, the impact on infrastructure. Looking at our primary subsector in Malawi, in our education system, we have almost 5.5 million learners. And even to this day, we do not have sufficient classroom space. We have a pupil to permanent classroom ratio of 116:1. And as things stand now, this leaves us with a deficit in classrooms of over 43,000 classrooms that we don't have. So when we experience disasters that damage school infrastructure, what it's doing is it sets us back on a situation that is already very dire. Because to be short of over 40,000 classrooms, that's a massive shortage. So as an education sector, we find ourselves playing catch up. So when we introduce climate change literacy in the education system, not only do we introduce the ability for the population, the ability for teachers, students, and government alike to begin to do something about these challenges. So in short, I would say, it is important because, first of all, if we look at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN urges the parties to the convention to take part, including, for example, undertaking educational and public awareness raising campaigns to ensure that the public can participate in climate change programs. And this is part of what can bring about solutions that can enable countries such as my country, Malawi, to deal with climate change impacts on the education system. Further, I would say that education enhances understanding and can encourage people to change their attitudes and behaviors and help them to make informed decisions. For example, when you have environmental degradation, that will not change unless people in the communities can change their behaviors. And education is key to that, because what we find is that when children learn about climate change in schools, they can also be agents of change amongst their peers as well as amongst their parents and guardians in the villages. because we find that children are probably amongst the most effective change agents when it comes to demanding from their parents and from their seniors in the villages to do something, say about stopping to use charcoal and planting woodlots and so on. So in all, what I would say, it is important to integrate climate change literacy in education because it empowers all people, but especially it motivates the young to take action.
Has Malawi taken any steps on this so far? What has the outcome been?
Yes, definitely. Malawi has taken steps, starting in 2014 when Malawi adopted or developed and adopted its first climate change learning strategy, which was assisted by UNDP. Malawi has then recently also reviewed that strategy. And since 2021, February 2021, meaning this year, we have a new strategy which builds on the previous one, learning lessons. And with that strategy, what we did was we used it to guide the review of our curriculum, both for primary schools and for secondary schools. And from that, we developed a source book and source book materials as well as posters. And we trained teachers to make sure that teachers can manage to carry the program. We've also made sure that climate change is a cross-cutting theme in subjects such as English and Chichewa, which is the local language, and the rest of the subjects that we offer in our curriculum. And there's overall about 25 subjects. A number of other practical activities have also been implemented to reinforce student understanding and more generally to mitigate the impact of climate change. These activities include, for example, school and community engagement in tree planting, rainwater harvesting, conservation agriculture, crop rotation, compost making, renewable energy projects, mainly off-the-grid solar energy. We also have a very special program where several schools are engaged in what we call a Living School Pioneer Project, incorporating climate change in issues such as health, water and sanitation, environmental awareness, and the utility of growing multiple varieties of food crops to enhance nutrition. As we speak, the number of schools that are taking part in this program are already experiencing the positive impacts. So these schools have already started to benefit from the establishment of woodlots, for example, of orchards and various vegetables in the vegetable gardens that the schools maintain. Indeed, what we find is that the education attainment is heavily affected by nutrition status of our learners. So in adopting these strategies to climate change, we're finding that we're also helping the overall improvement of the education sector by improving the education attainment. One of the outcomes on a more broad level has been that the introduction of climate change in the curriculum and associated school and community activities has helped to raise awareness on the subject, not only among teachers and learners, but also communities at large. This is important because what we find is that to sustain climate change activities in the education sector, we need resources. And to get those resources, we need community support. And the awareness amongst the community means that resource allocation to fighting climate change impacts has become increasingly easier because people understand the value of climate change literacy. The second area I wanted to underline is that the importance of avoiding deforestation and riverbank degradation for this country cannot be overemphasized. And in working with the school community and raising awareness of climate change literacy, we've managed to reach communities because almost every village has a school child. And through the schools, we're managing to reach the villages and we're managing to get a sea change in how the environment is viewed, especially in emphasizing the fact that everybody has a responsibility. And I think if I was to underline one major benefit at society level, that is one of them, because what it means is that in a way, Malawi has reached a point where we can say we're not going back, we're only going forward. We can only do better. We have everybody aware of the importance of taking care of the environment, of combating the impacts of climate change. And I think that can largely be put down to the effect of the education on climate change that my ministry has been undertaking over the years.
Thank you so much, Minister Nyalonje. We now will have an address from Alok Sharma, the president of COP26, the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference.
Education is a weapon that can change the world. That's what 16-year-old Mekdes told me when I visited Ethiopia in 2019. And in the fight against climate change, that weapon is invaluable. We know that learning empowers everyone to lead change, locally, nationally, and internationally. And we know that education can improve our responses to the climate crisis and reduce disaster-related deaths. Yet we also know that the climate crisis puts the education of children around the world in danger, placing everyone's right to be safe to learn in jeopardy. We cannot allow education to be a victim of climate change. So it's essential that we work to reduce its impacts on people and communities. And that's why protecting people and nature from the effects of climate change is one of our key priorities for the vital United Nations Climate Conference, COP26. And when disaster does strike, we must ensure that education continues, including through programs such as Education Cannot Wait, the Global Fund for Education in Emergencies, to which the UK is a leading donor. And this clearly reflects the fact that education, particularly for girls, is a real priority for the UK government. Earlier this year, Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced £430 million of new UK aid money for the Global Partnership on Education. And we launched a Girls' Education Action Plan, which includes commitments to address the link between climate and education. We must also make sure that women, girls, and all young people are helping to shape our response to the climate emergency, to ensure that their interests are represented. So COP26 will include a dedicated Gender Day, as well as a Youth and Public Empowerment Day, where education will be a focus. And we're calling on all countries to implement the Gender Action Plan, which helps countries to strengthen women's involvement in climate action, and to take gender into account in climate policies so that those policies advance equality. And we're committed to making progress on education at COP26. Countries will negotiate a new work plan for what is known as Action for Climate Empowerment. And these will be internationally agreed principles on engaging all of society in climate action. Countries will look at how we can put those principles into practice, and education will be a core part of this work. And I urge countries to be ambitious about what can be achieved in this area, ambitious so that COP26 delivers for education equality and gives us the best chance in the fight against climate change, and vitally gives our children the education they need, which is their right. Thank you.